Welcome to the Providence College Podcast. Subscribe to the show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Google Play. If you like what you hear, please review and share with others. Email podcast@providence.edu with questions or comments. Go Friars!
Hello and welcome to the Providence College Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Chittum, and I'm joined as always by Chris Judge, who's a producer and videographer here at PC. As always, we're here to bring you interesting stories from people in the Fryer family, and today we are lucky to have Dr. Jennifer Van Reet joining us. Professor Van Reet is associate professor of psychology. She's the assistant chair for that department. She's also the chair of the Undergraduate Research Committee and the director of KidThink. Jennifer, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Matt. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored.
Well, we were just talking about this before we went live, and you have so many titles. I mean, your business card, is it two-sided at this point?
It probably should be. As I was saying, the longer I'm here, the more the titles I keep adding. But that's fine with me because it means I get to do lots of really interesting work.
I can imagine. There's a lot of things that we can talk about, and we'll get into all of it. What's funny, I was looking at your biography on the PC website, and for research interest, I was reading it, and I immediately thought, I don't know what that means. It's so in-depth, but it can be applied to so many things. So I guess when you describe to people what your job is and what your role is at PC, how do you open up and how do you describe that?
So I'm always a little bit flustered when people ask me what I do. I don't go to many dinner parties these days because I have two young kids. But when I do, and people say, "What do you do?" I always pause for a second, and because I do a lot of things, and I've come to just answer that question by saying that I'm a scientist, because that's really how I think of myself. First and foremost, I think of myself as a scientist. I'm trained as a scientist, and that's what I get up in the morning and most excited to do is to do science. And I do science in a bunch of different ways. One of the things I do is I have my lab called KidThink on campus. Calling it a lab is kind of funny because it really just looks like a playroom, but it's where I do my work, and I can talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And I also do science through teaching. So part of my job is obviously I'm a professor, and I teach in the psychology department. But when I teach science. I teach about science. We do science in the classroom. So one of the ways that the students at PC learn psychology is by doing psychology and by actually performing the science of psychology. In fact, the two classes I'm teaching this spring are both classes with laboratory components, and all of the students are going to actually be doing psychological science. And that's one of the best things about my job is no matter what hat I'm wearing, whether it be my teaching hat, my research hat, or my committee hat, which is one of the other titles that you listed for me, it's all about science and research and active learning and discovery.
So what's the research that you're doing in your KidThink lab?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. We're doing a couple different things. And so let me just back up and give you a little bit of background, if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely.
The question that really gets me up in the morning and motivates me and has motivated me for the past, dozen or more years is how do we as people think about things that are not real? And it's a really tricky question. It's a complicated question, but it's fascinating to me because we as humans, kids, adults, all of us, we are so easily capable of thinking about things that are not real. So the things can include people, objects, events, fantastical worlds, lots of different things. And it can range from the mundane, like thinking about if I had only remembered to bring my umbrella today, to the wild and crazy imagining a completely alternate universe. This is wonderful cognitive power that we all have that enables art and enables scientific thinking. It enables us to do all sorts of things. And so I want to know how we can do that and why we can do that and what benefits it gives us to do that. But then primarily, when does that ability develop? and how does it develop? So that's really the main overall broad question that's motivating all my research and everything that I do in my lab. I've tackled that in a couple of different ways, but right now what I'm really interested in is the benefits of pretend play. So I've kind of settled on pretend play as the way that I'm really, really tackling this question of thinking about the unreal, and specifically pretend play in childhood right now is what I'm looking at. And even more specifically right now, I'm interested in if pretend play is valuable to children for learning. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of people out there right now in early childhood education, and a lot of parents, a lot of people in, say, the Providence Children's Museum, who I have a partnership with, who will tell you that play equals learning. So when young children are playing, they're learning. And I think this is a good message to send because we do want young children to be playing a lot. I'm just a little bit skeptical that it's really great for all types of learning. I think it's probably good for some types of learning, but just making this blanket statement that all play is good for learning is something I think that we just need to test and figure out whether or not it's actually true. So I'm doing some studies in my lab right now to try to see whether pretend play specifically is a good way for young children to learn new information and what specific types of information that might be good to learn in pretend play and what might not be so good to learn in pretend play.
So what kind of pretend play are you talking about for those kind of kids?
Sure. So because we're starting out very basic and we're doing this trying to do it in a really controlled laboratory way, we're doing some pretty basic pretending. And the children come in, usually they're preschool age children right now, so 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. We really like the preschool age because at that age, children are really great pretenders. I mean, there is no better pretender than a 4-year-old. They're just at peak pretending. As
a parent of a 4-year-old, I can testify to that.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Yeah. So the average American 4-year-old is spending roughly like 50 to 75% of their free time engaged in play, and a lot of that is pretend play. So they're really good at it. They really like to do it. So we hit that preschool age. We're also hitting that preschool age because this is the age where if they're in, especially an American preschool, they're often doing a lot of pretending, and the preschool teachers might be trying to actually teach them something in pretending. That's less likely to happen the older you get and the more you go into elementary school, but that play-based learning is really being emphasized right now in early childhood education, so we're trying to target the early childhood. And so a child might come into the lab, and depending on exactly which project we're doing, we're going to pretend with them and we're going to try to show them a new piece of information. One of the things we're doing right now is we're trying to see if children learn something about cause and effect in pretending. Cause and effect is a really kind of hard thing to nail down when you're a kid. So figuring out exactly what can cause what versus what's just correlated with something. And so we show them something completely novel. We show them a machine. We call it a Blickett machine. This is a well-known task in my field. And we show them that certain things make the Blickett machine go and other things don't make it go. And the first time we show that to them, we just pretend. We say that this is my pretend Blickett machine. I'm pretending that when I put something called a Blickett on it, it makes a really funny noise. And so we go through this whole thing and we show them this demonstration where we pretend that some things are Blickets and they make the machine go and other things are not. And after we make sure the kids are understanding what we're doing, they're paying attention, then we give them a real Blickett machine. And we say, here's a real Blickett machine. It looks just like the pretend one, except it's a different color. And here are some things. Can you make it go? So we're trying to see if they assume that the things that I pretended were Blickets might actually be real Blickets. So do they transfer that knowledge from pretending to reality? And we're in the middle of this. So we've done a couple different versions. But what it's looking like so far, and again, this may change, the nature of science, But what it's looking like is that they don't transfer this information at all.
Oh, wow.
So they don't assume that the things that I pretended were Blickets are actually Blickets in the real paradigm. And I want to emphasize that this paradigm, this using the Blicket machine, is a standard task in my field. It was developed in the late 1990s. And so we know that kids of this age can learn things about cause and effect using this machine and this paradigm. So it's not just that it's a weird thing. It's that they just don't assume that things that they hear about and pretending are real.
Interesting. And obviously when you say learning, there's a whole bunch of different things that you can learn. So, when you talk about pretend play, there's the learning piece, I would assume, of like, all right, communication is a big thing, especially if they're learning out loud. I mean, if they're pretending out loud, they're communicating, they're enunciating, they're doing that sort of thing with language. And you also have the piece where if they're doing all of those things too, there's potentially a moral component.
Sure.
Right, if they're acting out some sort of game or some interaction. So when you say learning, obviously you can go in so many different ways.
Yeah. This might take me the rest of my career, to be honest. No, those are two. The language you brought up and the morality piece are two really interesting pieces. I'm glad you did. One thing I'm trying to do with all this work is differentiate between learning and practicing. Those are both two types of learning and two things that are really valuable. Lots of research has shown that pretending is correlated with all sorts of really great things like good language and good empathy. And so people have assumed based on those correlations that pretending is kind of teaching children things like new language. I really don't think that's what's happening. I think that pretending is a great context for children to practice things that they've learned in the real world and solidify those skills. So they're practicing their language definitely, and their language is getting better through play. They're practicing their empathy and morality and pro-social behavior, and it's getting stronger. But I just don't think that's where they initially learn those things. So the language example is, I'm not sure a child could learn a new word in pretend play. And in fact, I had a student, her name's Michaela Fahey. She recently graduated, who that was her senior thesis, her independent study project was, can you teach a child a new word in pretend play? And so she as well targeted preschoolers, and she compared learning new words. So she tried to teach children 4 brand new words that we knew they didn't know. And she had a pretend play condition, and she compared that with a book reading condition, which is book reading is one place we know kids do learn a lot of words, to just a direct instruction condition, a condition where we just literally put the thing in front of the kid and said, this is a blank. And it turns out that the kids learned the words in the direct instruction condition, and they learned the words in the book reading condition, and they had no clue what those words were in the pretend play condition, even though they were very, very similar. So the children did not assume that these words that we were pretending with were actual real words. And why should they? I mean, we're pretending. In pretending, nothing has to be real. So I think kids are actually being really, really savvy. And they're engaged in a pretend world, and they hear this new piece of information. And I think it's actually really smart for them to assume that, or to be really skeptical and to assume that this might not actually be a real thing. Mm-hmm. And the morality piece, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because I had another student, her name is Annie Fast. And she is now a PhD candidate at the University of Washington in developmental psychology. And her senior thesis was all about, do children transfer their moral rules in pretending? So do they assume that the same moral rules apply when they're pretending? So we did a couple studies, again with preschoolers, and we told them all sorts of stories about children pretending to do things like steal, pretending to kick, pretending to do things that preschoolers know you really shouldn't do. Mm-hmm. And then we would ask the kids whether that was acceptable or not through a kind of a standard interview, a bunch of different questions.
Right.
And what we found, which I think was really interesting, is that our preschoolers were telling us that it was just as bad to pretend to kick somebody as it was to really kick somebody.
Really?
Just as bad. And not only that, they were telling us that the children deserved to be punished just as much as they would have in the real world. They did not differentiate at all, which we thought was so interesting, because when you watch kids pretend, I'm sure you might have seen this with your 4-year-old, they pretend to do bad stuff all the time.
And my daughter will tell me, Dad, I'm just pretending. Like, I have an 18-month-old, and she will pretend to kick, right, or hit or whatever. Sometimes it's not pretending, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
But it's, and then I'll say, Callie, remember, we don't do that. Just trying to reinforce the behavior, and hopefully that it just stays pretend and doesn't, become actual, hitting or whatever. And then she would, Dad, I'm just pretending.
Exactly. So my 3-year-old does the same thing. And so here we see a really interesting and kind of unsurprising difference between what kids do and what they'll say. So when we just ask them to reason it out and think it through, they're able to tell us that, maybe that's not really such a good thing, and they can't really differentiate it from reality. But what they're doing is a little bit different. And this is kind of a well-known finding in studies of prosocial behavior and moral reasoning, not only with kids, but adults too, is it's much easier to give the right answer than to actually do the right thing. So we don't think that's so surprising. Annie and I did a follow-up study to this, where we then told children stories of doing all these bad things in a really fantastical way. So not just a pretend way, but we would say that the people in the story were underwater, or they were playing stalker with stars, or they were, in some sort of really crazy, unrealistic environment. And that's when the kids started to differentiate. So that's now when the kids were saying, like, sure, it's okay to kick, and sure, it's okay to steal. If you're in a setting, in a context that's really obviously unreal, children start to realize that, okay, it is just pretend.
Right. So getting back to what you mentioned earlier, what should the role of play be? I guess, and obviously this is dependent on the age of the child.
Sure.
But the role of play in learning, especially, whether the kids, going to preschool or elementary school, or even, not that every minute has to be a learning experience explicitly when you're with your own children, but, for you it must be hard, right? Because like every day you're at home, it's like, is this a lab moment, or am I just having fun with my children right now? But, what role could that play for parents, trying to put some of this into practice and monitoring it and making sure that, they're going about things the right way?
Sure. So with the caveat that scientists always give, right? The caveat is always, we don't know yet, and we're working on it. But I think in some good kind of general principles, some rules of thumb would be don't assume children can learn brand new information in pretending. So if you really want to make sure that your child is learning something brand new, a new word, a new rule, something like that, give that to them outside of the pretend play context, and make sure they know this is real, this isn't reality. But also recognize that children do love pretending, especially those preschoolers, and that they do seem to practice, or they seem to kind of work through ideas and things in pretending. So when both of our children are quote unquote misbehaving, and they tell us it's just pretend, they're working through that. They're being smart, they're finding a way to do something that they know they shouldn't be doing, but they're getting around it. They're figuring out how they can. And that's good for children to play, children to experiment with new ideas and new things. The other thing I always tell parents is, don't be worried that your children are pretending fantasy with reality, or they're confusing pretending with reality. We know from lots and lots of work that even very young kids, 2-3-year-olds, they know the difference. They can tell the difference between pretending and reality, and from fantasy and reality. They're very, very good at figuring out where that boundary is, 90% of the time. Mm-hmm. So the question I usually get is something like, well, my kid has an imaginary companion. And I'm a little bit worried about that because they seem to be talking to thin air all the time. Imaginary companions are great.
As long as they're not a ghost in your house.
As long as they're not real. Kids who have an imaginary companions, their verbal skills tend to be the highest. They later tend to have good narrative ability. If your child has the cognitive capacity and the creativity to create a whole new person, go with it. That seems to be a sign of really good things, that they're really doing well from a cognitive standpoint. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing wrong with having an imaginary companion. The children know that imaginary companion isn't real. Even if they're acting like that child is real, I promise you the child knows that imaginary companion is actually not real. Interesting.
Now, how does... I guess when we're talking about this, I'm envisioning kids playing together in a room with, basically, creating worlds in their own heads and then talking about it. However, you can do it in a very different way. You can have, whether it's an iPad or some sort of screen availability where you can interact with a program or a game where it's not just a passive behavior, like a movie or something like that. They're actually creating a world using their fingers and that sort of sense. Do you get a similar, if you've tested it or just anecdotally, do you feel like it has the same sort of impact in that situation as opposed to the more typical we're playing and imagining type situation?
That's a really great question that I'm not going to be able to give you a satisfying answer to, I think. So the technology and the types of things that are available to kids have really outpaced our ability to study them. There has been, and we're catching up, sure, or my field is catching up, not me personally. The guidelines on screen time that were just updated by the American Academy of Pediatrics. And originally they took a really hard stance against screen time and keep kids away from screens. And they've really relaxed those a little bit, and recognizing that I think screens are everywhere. There's lots of different types of screens. There's lots of different things kids can do with screens.
Right. It's not all created equal. It's not like watching TV is the same as, doing something that has some sort of cognitive benefit.
Exactly. So I think and again, we don't know yet. And I definitely am not up 100% on the very latest studies that have been done. But it seems like if children are being active, that's good. Right? So active is better than passive. If they're interacting also with the device, but then a parent is with them, it's kind of scaffolding that, and a parent is, or a teacher, or a more knowledgeable peer even, if there's some sort of way that the lesson or whatever's happening on that screen can be reinforced, that seems to be a good thing too. Kids are getting a little bit more when there's somebody helping them try to figure out what am I supposed to be taking away from this game or this app or this book or whatever it is.
Right. Oftentimes when we're having this conversation, you keep saying we, which is fantastic, because I know that you're not doing this alone. You have colleagues and you also have plenty of students that work with you.
Yeah.
So what is that relationship like for you and your students, whether they're in your class or you have this lab experience? What's that dynamic like?
Yeah, I always say we because this is not, my name might be on the research or the first person on it, but I can't do it without my team. So my personal research, I have a team of students always with me, the Kid Think team. So we call our lab Kid Think because we study how kids think. And for any one semester, I have between 4 and 10 students who are working with me in a variety of capacities. They're either volunteering their time just to get some experience, or they're earning course credit. So in the psychology department, you can take a course called Research in Psychology, where you earn 3 hours of course credit for working in a lab, or they're conducting their own independent study projects and taking a class called Independent Study. And I can't do anything that I do without my team. In fact, I guarantee you that my seniors, my team, especially the ones who've been with me for a while, know how my lab works much better than I do. I actually come to them with questions sometimes. It's like, guys, how do we do this? And they'll tell me. So they run everything. They schedule appointments. They recruit for me, then find children and families who are interested in participating in our studies. They test the children that come into the lab. They code data. They enter data. They help me analyze it. They help me present it. They do everything. We do it all together. So I'm responsible for charting the course, writing the grants, getting us the funding, giving kind of the broad outline, and then they take it from there and they do it.
Now, why is that? And this is going to sound like a dumb question, but I'm trying to tee it up for you at the same time. Like, why is that important in their learning, especially in the higher education model? Why is that important for their learning and for, their futures, whether it's in this field or whatever offshoot they end up going down?
Sure. It's important in a couple different ways. So first of all, the vast majority of the students in my lab are psychology majors, although every now and then I'm lucky enough to get an elementary ed, special ed education major working with me. So for the first part, it reinforces what they're learning in their class. So it reinforces all the psychology majors take research courses, courses in research design, courses in statistics. So it's letting them practice those skills and those things that they're learning. So that's one, but there's a lot of other skills. So it's skills like working with participants, working with families, things like how to explain a complex research project to a parent who's coming in, time management, organization, lots of these other just professional skills that will serve students well in whatever domain they choose to go into after graduation, whether they choose to go to graduate school or whether they choose to go into some other industry or get some sort of other job. These are all really just important skills to be practicing. The other thing is that we're a team, we're a little community. So it's another place on campus where you can get to know your peers. You can practice skills like working with others, working in a team. What happens in my lab is oftentimes students will join us sophomores and juniors and then stay with me. And so they quote unquote rise in the hierarchy. So they gain responsibilities. And by the time you're a senior, you might be lab manager. And so you're taking on a leadership role and you're practicing those skills, those management skills and managing people and training new research assistants, things like that. So it reinforces what we're doing in the classroom. It allows students to practice both academic and non-academic skills that is going to be very, very useful wherever they end up.
Right. I mean, those soft skills are important, like you said, in any field that they would potentially go into. And it's obviously the one that they're probably more likely to go into given their field of study. And at the same time, I get that kind of dovetails really well with what you do in another area.
Yes.
We spoke earlier about your work with Undergraduate Research Committee.
Yes. As
the chair. I guess before I get into that, I just want to mention real quick, it's great how on the PC KidThink website, how you have updates on all of the students, maybe not all, I don't know, maybe it is all the students who've helped you over the years on the website. And it's very obvious, even before we sat down and talked about this, that you have a lot of pride and connection with those students and what they've achieved, not only at PC, but moving forward and kind of keeping that dynamic.
Oh, yes. So when you become a member of my lab, especially if you stay for a year or two, we get to know each other really, really well. And now I've been here long enough to where I have a whole kind of network of KidThink alumni in various places. And to the best of my ability, we do try to keep in touch and know what people are doing. And so I have students who have gone on in developmental psychology, lots of students that go on to be school psychologists, some students who have gone on to work in other research fields or clinical psychology. I have one student, Colleen, who's working for a study abroad company right now and who's really happy. And so, we're a whole community.
That's great. And it's nice for, someone who comes into the residential higher education model to have that sort of relationship, not only to their professor, but their peers that can, go past, their 4 years here to school and really make that lasting impact. That's for sure. And
it's wonderful for me too. I love getting to know the students. I love sharing something of myself and my family with them, and some of my happiest memories are working with and getting to know the students from my lab.
Oh, that's great. And the Undergraduate Research Committee that you're part of kind of sets that up for the rest of the campus as well. And I know that there's kind of two different parts that we can talk about. Can you just introduce them real quick and say, what are the differences between the two that we mentioned? What is the Veritas group, kind of the small grant group?
Yeah. So, the Undergraduate Research Committee is a campus-wide committee. So it's not just psychologists and people in the traditional sciences. We're a committee of faculty from all over campus. The committee was created in 2009, and I've been lucky enough to serve on it since 2009. The original chair of the committee was Jack Green, who did a wonderful job. And then I took over from him a couple years ago as chair. And our job is to broaden opportunities for undergraduate research all across campus. And we do that in a couple ways. The primary way we do it is by giving money to students to conduct research. And we have a couple different grant programs. During the academic year, the fall and the spring, we run something called the Small Grants Program. And students can apply at various points during the academic year to get some funds to do a research project. It can be individuals or groups, so we offer both types of grants. And the individual grants run about $500 or so. The group grants are larger because they're usually bigger projects. And students can request money for supplies that they need to do their work, or money to help travel to sites to collect data or to conduct research at other places. And this just allows students to think a little bit bigger and do bigger projects than they might otherwise have been able to without the funding. So in a typical year, we give out between $20,000 and $30,000 worth of this grant money. Last year, I think we funded close to 50 students. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but it was around 50 students.
And how many applied? I know you don't have numbers in front of you, but just generally.
For the small grants program, we're pretty lucky and we can fund almost everybody that applies. So I would say our percentage is pretty high. So maybe out of 75 students who applied, roughly 50 got a grant. Again, I could have those numbers slightly off, but it's about that. Also, one thing that's nice about the small grants program is because we do have 4 deadlines a year, we really do encourage students who don't get the grant on their first try to try again. And usually always with feedback, students are able to be successful if they try on another round. The other programs we run are summer grants. And these are bigger because in addition to getting about $500 for supplies for your research, over the summer we provide students with a stipend. So we pay them that's their job. Their job is to do their research project full time. So the summer grants, students can apply for funding from anywhere between 4 and 10 weeks. And they get a set stipend per week. Last year, I believe it was $400 a week. And we tell them, this is your job. So for this, between 4 and 10 weeks, your job is to conduct this particular research project. And again, they have some money to gather supplies. So this is a more competitive program because it's a bigger grant. So we have, there's fewer that we can give out. But we typically give out between 7 and 10 research summer grants a year. And it is the most transformative experience for the students to be able to have this chunk of time to where this is all they're doing. They're just immersing themselves in this one question or this one project.
Right.
students come back and really say that it changes so much. It changes how they think about their field. It changes how they think about their education. It changes how they think about their future plans. So I've had students come back and say that grad school was never in my thought. It was never going to be for me. And now I can't imagine doing anything else. I want to keep doing this. Students, the results of these projects, students present them at conferences. Some of them are published. And so it's a really wonderful experience. Last year, for the very first time, 4 of those summer projects were given a special designation. They were Veritas grants. And these 4 projects, these 4 Veritas grants, were made possible by a wonderful donation that the college received. An anonymous donor heard about our summer program and wanted to make it possible for even more students to do that. So now we have an endowment to where every summer we're going to be able to give 4 additional students this experience through this fund. And it really, every additional student we can give this experience to it just makes me so happy.
And I think it's, when people think of research, especially in the context of our conversation, because you're a scientist, you do scientific research, people think of sciences when I think of research usually. And I know with these, this is very broad-based academically. In fact, on our podcast, we had Blaine Pear a couple months ago, who did basically the exact opposite of scientific research in some of what he did in more of a normal context when he was looking at zombie movies and how it pertains to economic and social factors throughout history. And I know for you, I can see you light up when I brought that up, because I know it's a hot button, not hot button issue, but an important point to be made when people are considering applying for these grants. Yes.
So again, we are a campus-wide committee, and we really want to represent all the disciplines on campus. So not just kind of the traditional sciences and psychology, social sciences, but the humanities, the fine arts, the business school, the professional studies. One theme of our committee work, and one thing that we try to say whenever we can to students, is that every single discipline does scholarship in some way. Every single discipline. Every professor on this campus is doing scholarship or has done scholarship. Everybody's creating new knowledge. That's what the campus is about. And so scholarship exists in every discipline, and every student on this campus could get involved in that, no matter what their interests are. You don't have to be a chemistry major to do research. You can do research in fine arts. You can do research in philosophy, like Blaine was doing.
Right.
You can do research in business. You can do research in education. Just ask your professors, what do they do? What research look like in their field? And everyone can do this.
It's funny when you see a parody of on occasion you might see like a parody of higher education where you see 20 or 30 students in a room, a professor at the front of the classroom lecturing on in a monotone voice. You think of like Ferris Bueller's Day Off, like the teacher in front of the classroom. But you talk about these sorts of initiatives.
Yeah.
And it's the exact opposite. And it must have just a huge impact on people's learning and just their excitement to be involved in this sort of community.
I hope so. And the move toward more active types of learning, like you're talking about. So not having every experience on campus be just sitting and listening to a lecture and taking notes is really a priority, I think, for PC in general. So we have the Center for Engaged Learning now. And so these active learning experiences, these research experiences fall under that broad umbrella of engaged learning. And it's a priority on campus to get as many of these kind of engaged learning experiences into our classrooms and giving more and more opportunities for students. And it doesn't just have to be research. Like I said, there are other types of engaged learning experiences, but research is one that is available and accessible to every PC student if they want it. And you don't have to, the other thing I tell students is you don't have to be a senior. You don't have to wait until senior year and wait until like I think students sometimes have this idea that, well, I have to take all these classes and then all of a sudden like a big research question is just going to hit me. Like I'm just going to find it, and that's not going to be until senior year. No, that doesn't. Sometimes that happens, but it doesn't have to be that happens. So you can get involved as a freshman or a sophomore just by working as an assistant. Just kind of saying, do you need any help? Can I help you do a little bit here and there? And if you're working on somebody else's project, you're seeing what they're doing, you're gaining some skills, you're learning how things are done, even if it's just, a couple hours a week. And then that's how you build up. You build up by learning those foundational skills. And then the more you immerse yourself in that field and the more you learn about that scholarship, then, the questions can start to come.
Yeah, I mean, this is purely anecdotal, but when I think about my own college experience, the things that stick out most from an academic perspective are, the conversations that I have that were probably outside of the classroom, but topics that were brought up in the classroom. But the really what struck with me was the conversations I had with professors, the interactions I had, or peers that kind of took the classroom topic and made it, more interactive in my own context.
Yeah.
And kind of bring my own personality to bear on the subject. And, I think that this sort of thing, especially now with the availability of lectures from every college out there and different platforms and different videos, the engaged learning piece not only is important in its own right, but especially when you compare it to the current availability of other lectures out there, it really can take a central role in higher education moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Between having the Center for Engaged Learning here and the Center for Teaching Excellence here, I think we as faculty have a lot of leeway to try out some of these things, these engaged learning practices, to really make our classrooms into laboratories. I mean, that's something that's near and dear to my heart, since I, like I said at the very beginning, I am a scientist, and I think of myself as a scientist first and foremost. And so if I can really break down the divide between my classroom and my laboratory and have it all be one thing, that's kind of my end goal. Is the classroom is the lab. What we're doing is we're creating new knowledge and we're learning things at the same time.
That's great. And I think before we get going, we're here in Harkins Hall right now because we were originally going to be in your lab doing this, which would have been great. But there's extensive construction going on where you are. And how was that, obviously the phases of the science building renovation, to SOA, Albertus Magnus, and Hickey, that's a long-term project.
It is.
Because we have to renovate the building as we're using it. So there's kind of 4 or 5 phases that are associated with it. But how is that going to impact you personally and your department and your students?
So right now, we're dealing with a little bit of noise, but that's just because we're on winter break. So all the noise and stuff will stop as soon as the classes start. The first thing that's going to happen is, I'm sure lots of your listeners know, is that the addition to the building is going to be built, and that is scheduled to open right now, or they tell us, fall 2018. So initially, it's not going to have too much of an impact. So our existing facilities are going to be left, it sounds like, pretty well alone, although there's going to be, obviously some places in the building where they need to be. And then the new addition space, it just looks amazing. We're so excited about it. There's going to be several classrooms in that space and a couple of labs. And so once that addition opens, anything that we can do in the addition, we're going to. And then we're just going to kind of play musical chairs, right? So they're going to renovate the building. It sounds like, again, this is all preliminary plans, in pieces, and we're going to make it work. I'm not going to lie and say that it won't be a little bit disruptive to kind of move our labs around. But we're super excited about the renovations. Obviously, all of us got to design our new labs, and it's not very often as an academic that you get to do that. You get to sit down with the architects and say, like, this would be my ideal lab. Can you please give it to me? So it'll be a few years of again, like playing musical chairs. But in the end, I think it's all worth it.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been fantastic.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. It was fun.
All right. Well, hey, good luck this coming semester, and thanks again.
Thank you.